Classical music isn't for kids like you. Professor Richard Hawthorne's voice echoed through the chandeliered concert hall of Eastwood Academy. His tailored suit shimmered under the lights as he sneered at 12-year-old Jamal Rivers. The boy clutched his father's battered violin case, its leather handle wrapped in duct tape. Laughter spilled from students and board members seated on marble benches. Maybe try rap instead, Hawthorne smirked. 30 witnesses leaned forward, ready to enjoy another humiliation. But what none of them knew was that Jamal Rivers had exactly 8 minutes to flip the script, 8 minutes to silence the laughter, rewrite the rules, and prove that genius doesn't check your bank account before it chooses you. 3 hours before Jamal Rivers stood on the stage of Eastwood Academy, the world around him was far smaller, far rougher, and infinitely more fragile than those marble halls. His day began at 5 a.m. with the screaming alarm clock that had been rescued from a thrift store bin, its plastic cracked, its red digits flickering like a dying heartbeat. The Rivers family apartment sat on the third floor of a crumbling brick building on Detroit's east side. The building had once been red and proud, but decades of exhaust, weather, and neglect had turned its face a mottled brown-gray. Inside apartment 3B, the radiator coughed like an asthmatic giant, pipes rattling as if begging for mercy. The wallpaper had peeled away long ago, leaving plaster stains shaped like continents nobody wanted to discover. A water spot above Jamal's bed resembled Africa, and each year it spread a little farther, as if slowly swallowing the ceiling. Jamal swung his thin legs out of bed, the soles of his socks meeting the cold linoleum floor that curled at the corners. The air smelled faintly of instant coffee, cleaning chemicals, and the fried chicken someone downstairs must have reheated before dawn. He rubbed his eyes and, before brushing his teeth or eating breakfast, reached for the most important object in the world, his father's violin. The case was a battlefield survivor. Its once black leather had faded to gray, the handle wrapped in duct tape, the brass latches rusted but still clinging. Jamal opened it gently, reverently, as if opening a treasure chest. Inside, resting on threadbare purple velvet, was the violin. Its varnish had long since lost its luster, the wood dulled by time and touched with a fine crack across the back that had been sealed with glue and prayer. Yet when Jamal lifted it, the instrument came alive in his hands, warm against his collarbone, familiar as breathing. He raised the bow, frayed, its horsehair missing in patches, and let it hover above the strings. In that cramped apartment, between a broken refrigerator and a leaning kitchen table, music became the only magic that existed. He closed his eyes and played the Allemande from Bach's Partita Nr. 2. The first note wavered, the pitch slightly sharp, but then steadied. The melody stretched into the dark corners of the apartment, filling every crevice where despair tried to live. From the bathroom came the sound of running water, and then the heavy shuffle of tired feet. Denise Rivers stepped into the kitchen, still wearing her faded hospital scrubs, her sneakers scuffed from countless night shifts. She was only 38, but fatigue had etched lines across her forehead, and her hands were cracked from bleach and industrial soap. Yet her eyes softened when she saw her son standing there with the violin pressed against his chin, bow moving with fierce determination. "Baby, you're gonna wake the whole building," she said, her voice low but carrying warmth. Jamal froze, embarrassed. "Sorry, Mama. I just wanted to get one more run-through before school." Denise poured herself a mug of coffee so black it looked like tar, then sat at the wobbly kitchen table. The table leg was propped up by a stack of old magazines, Ebony, Jet, and some outdated hospital journals she'd taken from work. Beside her coffee cup sat the jar labeled Jamal's Music Fund. Inside were only a few crumpled dollar bills and loose change. She glanced at it, sighed, then looked back at her son. "You know what day it is," she said gently. "I know." His voice carried a mix of nerves and fire. He lowered the violin, placed it back in its case with the same care a priest gives to holy relics, and sat across from her. For a moment, silence hung between them, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. Then Denise asked the question she always asked before big moments. What did your daddy always tell you? Jamal's voice steadied as he repeated words that had become scripture in their home. Music doesn't come from the violin. It comes from here, he tapped his chest. And here, he touched his forehead. And, she pressed, and don't ever let anyone tell you where your music belongs. Denise reached across the table, her rough hands warm and steady. That's right. You remember that when you walk into that academy with their marble floors and gold chandeliers. They may have instruments worth more than our rent for a year, but they don't have what you got. What's that? Fire, she said. Hunger. The kind of music you can't buy. Jamal looked around the apartment, the peeling paint, the cracked linoleum, the second-hand sofa whose springs had long given up, the stack of bills on the counter. He thought of the neighbors, Mrs. Johnson's TV always blaring crime news through the wall, the Hernandez baby crying upstairs, the couple arguing about rent in Spanish down the hall. This world was heavy, worn, tired, but it was also the forge where his music was tempered. After breakfast, 2 slices of toast and half a banana they split, Jamal went back to polishing his violin. He used an old cloth cut from his dad's shirt. Every scratch on the wood told a story. The wedding his father had played, the church services, the street performances that helped pay rent when shifts at the plant dried up. Terrence Rivers had believed in this instrument more than anything, right up until the heart attack that stole him at 39. Jamal could still hear his father's laugh, see his hands guiding his fingers along the fingerboard, reminding him that music was survival. Denise stood in the doorway, watching her son with a mix of pride and fear. She remembered Terrence playing lullabies to Jamal as a baby, the way the boy had hummed melodies before he could even form full sentences. Now, at 12, Jamal played with a ferocity that felt larger than their cramped world. Today was the scholarship audition at Eastwood Academy, the kind of opportunity people whispered about but never believed would happen to kids from places like theirs. The thought made her chest tighten. If he won, doors would open. Private lessons, summer programs in Vienna, a future Terrence had dreamed of. But if he lost, the rejection could crush him. And Denise had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let her boy break. The morning unfolded in a series of small but telling moments. Jamal ironed his only dress shirt, borrowed from his cousin 2 sizes larger, and the sleeves still dangled past his wrists. Denise used safety pins to hold the fabric at his shoulders so it wouldn't swallow him whole. His black shoes, polished as best as they could manage, squeaked when he walked. They were a size too tight, but new shoes weren't an option. Before leaving, Denise dug into her purse and pulled out a faded photograph. Terrence holding the violin on their wedding day, his grin wide, his eyes full of dreams. She tucked it into Jamal's violin case. Take him with you, she said. At 7:30 a.m., they stepped out into the sharp Detroit air. The streets were quiet except for buses groaning past and the distant echo of sirens. Denise's old Honda Civic coughed to life after 2 tries, rattling as if it resented every mile. Jamal held the violin case in his lap, staring at the skyline where Eastwood Academy's spire cut against the morning light. The ride downtown was both short and eternal. They passed boarded-up storefronts, graffiti-tagged walls, and liquor stores with neon signs flickering even in daylight. Then the scenery shifted. New condos, sleek cafes, cars worth more than their building. Jamal's stomach clenched as the Civic pulled into the circular drive of Eastwood Academy, where limestone columns and crystal windows gleamed like something out of a dream. Other families were already arriving. Parents in tailored suits escorted children in pressed uniforms, their glossy instrument cases swinging like jewelry. A girl stepped out of a Mercedes holding a violin case that probably cost more than Denise's car. Jamal instinctively tugged his father's patched case closer to his chest. Denise parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the gleaming cars. She turned to her son, her eyes steady despite the exhaustion written across her face. Remember what we said this morning? Yes, Mama. And what did your daddy always say? That the music comes from here and here, Jamal repeated, touching his chest and head. She smiled and kissed his forehead. Good. Now go show them what they've never seen before. Jamal stepped on out of the Civic, the cold air biting at his cheeks. His oversized shirt fluttered against his thin frame. The violin case felt heavy in his hand, not because of the wood inside, but because of the weight of his father's dreams, his mother's sacrifices, and every late night he'd practiced until his fingers bled. He walked toward the academy's massive oak doors. Students stared. Parents whispered. The polished marble steps reflected the morning sun, making them seem to stretch endlessly upward. At the top, Professor Richard Hawthorne stood in the entryway, his gold watch gleaming, his silver hair perfectly combed. He watched Jamal climb the stairs with the faintest curl of disdain at the edge of his mouth. 3 hours from now, those same lips would struggle to form words. But Jamal didn't know that yet. All he knew was that he had one chance to play, one chance to prove that fire mattered more than polish, and that the voice of his father's violin belonged on any stage in the world. And as he pushed open the heavy oak doors of Eastwood Academy, part one of his story came to its end, not with applause, but with the silence of marble halls waiting to be shocked into life. The oak doors of Eastwood Academy swung inward with a groan that felt older than the city itself. Jamal Rivers stepped through, clutching his father's violin case like a lifeline. Behind him, Denise's sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world shifted. Inside, light spilled through cathedral windows, striking gilded railings and marble busts of composers. Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, whose stone gazes followed newcomers with eternal judgment. Students in pressed uniforms hurried through the corridors, their glossy shoes clicking like metronomes. Parents whispered about summer programs in Vienna and private lessons in Salzburg. Jamal felt their eyes on him. The oversized shirt, the scuffed shoes, the duct-tape violin case. He might as well have been carrying a brick of shame. Denise touched his shoulder. Head up, baby. Remember, they don't get to decide your worth. Upstairs, in an office overlooking the Academy's sculpture garden, Professor Richard Hawthorne poured himself a cup of coffee from a silver carafe. The office looked less like a workplace and more like a museum at Gweben curated to impress donors. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held first editions of music scores. The walls displayed photographs of Hawthorne shaking hands with world-famous conductors. A Steinway baby grand piano gleamed in the corner, its black surface so polished it reflected the chandelier above. At 58, Hawthorne moved with the assurance of a man who had never been told no. His navy blazer carried the Academy's golden crest. His tie, silk imported from Milan, was knotted with surgical precision. He lifted the file from his desk and sneered as he scanned the name. Jamal Rivers. Jefferson Middle School. No private teacher. Self-taught. iPhone recordings for application, he muttered, almost amused. Single mother, custodial work, East Side address, a charity case wrapped in duct tape. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Eleanor Price entered with a thermos in hand. At 72, she had sharp eyes that could slice through arrogance like a scalpel. Her silver hair, cropped neatly, glinted in the sunlight. She had founded Eastwood Academy 4 decades earlier with a philosophy she never abandoned. Talent recognizes no economic boundaries. Hawthorne, she said, settling into the leather chair across from him. Are you prepared for this morning's auditions? As prepared as one can be, he replied dryly, tapping Jamal's file. Though I question why we persist with this outreach charade, it wastes everyone's time. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. That charade has produced some of our finest musicians. You remember Sandra Lou? Full scholarship. Now she's principal, second violin in Boston. An exception that proves the rule, Hawthorne countered. These inner-city students arrive with passion, but no discipline. Emotion over technique. Years of bad habits. if they survive at all. He flipped Jamal's file shut with theatrical disdain. This one, for instance, has chosen box partita number 2. Ambitious for someone who learned from YouTube videos, he'll drown in it. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with warning. Or perhaps he'll reveal something you've forgotten, that music isn't just mathematics. It's life, fire, hunger. Hawthorne smirked, checking his gold watch. We'll see, but I assure you, Eleanor, today will end as it always does. The scholarship goes to someone prepared, someone polished, not a boy with duct tape holding his world together. Eleanor rose, her expression carved from stone. Careful, Richard. Sometimes the most extraordinary music comes from the most unexpected places. And if you misjudge him in front of witnesses, you'll regret it. Her footsteps echoed as she left the office, leaving Hawthorne momentarily unsettled. He straightened his papers unnecessarily, convincing himself that his instincts had never failed in 3 decades. Today would be no different. Back downstairs, Jamal and Denise checked in at the registration desk. A young assistant handed Jamal a number, applicant Mumford, and directed them to the waiting hall. The hall smelled faintly of polish and money. Plush red chairs lined the walls. Applicants sat with their parents, instruments resting like ornaments. A boy polished his French horn with a silk cloth. A girl unzipped a carbon fiber violin case that gleamed like liquid silver. Their parents whispered encouragements that sounded more like instructions. Keep your bow straight. Don't rush the cadenza. Remember Vienna in July. Jamal lowered himself into a chair beside Denise. His violin case looked pitiful next to the gleaming ones around him. The other students glanced at it, then at him, their expressions a cocktail of pity and superiority. One boy leaned toward his friend and whispered, just loud enough for Jamal to hear. What's he doing here? Looks like he found that thing in a dumpster. Denise shot the boy a glare so sharp it silenced him instantly. Then she turned to Jamal, lowering her voice. Ignore them. You've got something they'll never understand. Jamal nodded, though his stomach twisted. He opened the case and checked the violin again. His hands trembled slightly as he tightened the bow. From somewhere deep inside, his father's voice whispered, the music doesn't come from the violin. It comes from you. Meanwhile, the audition hall upstairs filled with board members and faculty, 30 people in all, Detroit's cultural elite, patrons of the symphony, collectors who beat Stradivarius violins at auctions, faculty members whose resumes included Juilliard in Vienna. They settled into velvet chairs, programs in hand, expecting entertainment and affirmation of their superiority. Hawthorne took his place at the mahogany podium. He welcomed the audience with a smooth baritone voice that carried authority. The first applicants performed flawlessly, polished, precise, forgettable. A boy in a taïdo delivered a Mozart concerto with clinical accuracy. A girl in a silk dress played Tchaikovsky with fingers so clean they sounded mechanical. Applause was polite, not passionate, but the board members were satisfied. This was the kind of talent they understood. Packaged, practiced, predictable. Then Hawthorne cleared his throat. Our final audition of the morning, he announced, his voice dripping with anticipation. Applicant number 14, Jamal Rivers, from Jefferson Middle School. The room shifted, pens poised, eyebrows raised. A ripple of amusement spread through the advanced students seated in the back. Downstairs, Jamal heard his number called. His pulse thundered in his ears. Denise squeezed his hand. Go on, baby. Show them. He stood, shoulders trembling, but spine straight. With his father's violin in hand, he followed the assistant toward the double doors of the audition hall. Each step across the marble corridor sounded like a drumbeat leading to battle. When the doors opened, light spilled out like revelation. 30 pairs of eyes turned to him, dissecting every detail. The oversized shirt, the taped case, the scuffed shoes. Professor Hawthorne smiled, the kind of smile wolves give sheep. Mr. Rivers, he said smoothly, do make yourself comfortable. I trust you've brought an instrument. Laughter rippled across the hall. Jamal's knuckles tightened on the case handle. His father's words echoed louder now, louder than the ridicule. Music doesn't come from the violin. It comes from here. He stepped onto the stage, and in that moment, the fate of everyone in the hall began to shift, though they didn't know it yet. The stage at Eastwood Academy felt enormous, a sea of polished hardwood stretching beneath chandeliers that shimmered like frozen fire. Jamal Rivers stood at its center, his knees threatening to buckle under the weight of 30 judging eyes. He set his violin case down on the piano bench. The latch clicked open, and the faded purple velvet lining glowed under the lights. He lifted the violin with a reverence that contrasted with the snickers echoing from the back rows. Professor Richard Hawthorne leaned on the podium, lips curled in a predator's smile. "Is that your instrument, Mr. Rivers?" he asked, his voice drenched in mock concern. "Yes, sir. It was my father's." Jamal's voice quivered, but he forced steadiness into the final word. The professor's smirk widened. "I see. Well, as you can imagine, we maintain certain standards at Eastwood. Perhaps you would be more comfortable in our beginner program. They have instruments better suited for your experience level." The insult rippled through the audience like a cold draft. Faculty members shifted uncomfortably. Board members exchanged glances, some smirking, others raising brows. A girl with a platinum bob whispered behind her manicured hand, laughter bubbling. Jamal felt his face burn. He could almost hear the words echoing back from every rejection he'd ever faced. Too poor, too small, too much dream, not enough reality. But then, like a thread pulled through the chaos, came his father's voice. "Music doesn't come from the violin. It comes from here." Jamal touched his chest, subtly, as if steadying himself. "Thank you for your concern, Professor," he said, surprising even himself with the calm in his tone. "But this violin has music to share." A hush fell. Hawthorne's smile faltered, just for an instant. Then he recovered, adjusting his gold watch. "Very well. You insist on performing the Bach partita in D minor?" "Yes, sir." "You do realize this piece has humbled graduates with far more training than you've had access to?" His voice carried the weight of final judgment, daring the boy to retreat. Jamal's fingers curled tighter around the violin's neck. His borrowed shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. He glanced toward the third row, where Dr. Eleanor Price sat rigid, her sharp eyes fixed not on him but on Hawthorne, as though she already sensed the storm brewing. The silence was suffocating. 30 people held their breath, waiting for the boy from Detroit's east side to back down, to mumble an apology, to fold into the narrative they had already written for him. But Jamal Rivers did not fold. He lifted the violin to his shoulder. The wood, warm and familiar, pressed against his collarbone like an anchor. He raised the bow. His arms trembled, but not from fear alone, from the enormity of what this moment carried. His father's dreams, his mother's sacrifices, his own relentless hours in that cramped apartment with peeling paint and rattling pipes. He took one final breath, then looked directly at Hawthorne. "I'd like to play the Bach, please." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond. The ripples were visible on every face. A board member's pen froze above her notepad. A student in the back stiffened, his smirk dissolving. The chandeliers seemed to hold their glow a heartbeat longer. Waiting. Then Jamal set bow to string. The first note was not perfect. The intonation leaned sharp, but it was alive. It cut through the perfume-thick air with startling purity, ringing against marble walls as if summoning something older and truer than the academy itself. The audience stilled. Conversations died mid-syllable. A cough halfway to release was swallowed. Even Hawthorne's smirk froze, as if he'd suddenly realized the script was veering off course. Jamal closed his eyes. In his mind, he was no longer standing on marble under chandeliers. He was back in apartment 3B, where the radiator clanked like percussion, where his mother brewed bitter coffee, where his father's laughter lingered like an unfinished song. He was practicing in a space too narrow for sound to bloom, pouring his hunger into every imperfect scale until the music began to live inside him. His fingers danced across the fingerboard with the urgency of survival. Each shift between positions was muscle memory carved by countless dawns. His bow arm, though untrained in formal technique, moved with raw instinct, sometimes too heavy, sometimes too light, but always honest. The Alamonda unfolded. Notes cascaded not like a polished recital, but like truth being spoken aloud for the first time. His vibrato wavered, yet it pulsed with emotion that sterile training could never mimic. Crescendos rose not because theory demanded them, but because his heart did. In the front row, Dr. Eleanor Price leaned forward, lips parting slightly. She had watched prodigies collapse under the weight of their own polish. But here was something else. Music as necessity, as survival. The Corrente followed, quick and relentless. Jamal's fingers blurred, sliding with surprising fluidity into higher positions. He missed one shift. A squeak broke the spell, but he caught it, recovered, drove forward. It wasn't flawless. It wasn't meant to be. It was real, pulsing with the rhythm of a boy who had practiced through sirens and slammed doors, who had learned to keep playing when neighbors shouted to shut up, when the world demanded silence. Whispers faded, pens lowered. One board member blinked rapidly, surprised by the sudden lump in her throat. A student in the back who had been smirking now stared at his own expensive violin case, uncomfortable with the comparison. Jamal opened his eyes as he approached the sarabande. The room blurred. He saw not faces but memories. His father's calloused hands guiding his mother's tired smile at dawn, his own reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, bow in hand, promising himself he would never give up. The first note of the sarabande landed heavy, resonant, like a prayer poured onto the marble floor. Time slowed. The silence between the phrases became as meaningful as the notes themselves. Tears pricked at the edges of eyes around the room, not from technical brilliance, but from recognition, the recognition of truth too raw to ignore. Even Professor Hawthorne shifted behind his podium, his hand tightened on its edge. For the first time in decades, he wasn't certain of what he was hearing. By the time Jamal launched into the giga, sweat dripped down his temple, but his energy soared. The music raced, demanding impossible shifts, double stops, bow strokes so quick they blurred. His technique, though imperfect, carried the ferocity of someone with nothing to lose. His left hand leapt across the fingerboard with desperation disguised as brilliance. His bow arm attacked the strings with controlled chaos. The hall vibrated with sound too big for one boy with a battered violin. Each note felt like defiance, each phrase a declaration. You said I didn't belong. You said this wasn't for kids like me. Listen now. Students in the back no longer smirked. They leaned forward, jaws slack. Faculty members exchanged glances, scribbled frantic notes. Even board members accustomed to charity auditions found themselves gripping their programs as though witnessing something historic. And at the center of it all, Jamal Rivers stood straighter, taller, as though his father's spirit had settled on his shoulders, steadying him. The final note rang out, suspended in the air like a bell refusing to fade. Jamal held it, bow trembling, until silence became thunder. He lowered the violin, his chest heaved, sweat dampened his collar. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. 30 people trapped between disbelief and awe. The silence became unbearable. And then, one pair of hands began to clap. The last note of Bach's Giga still lingered in the air, as if marble walls had absorbed the vibration and were reluctant to release it. Jamal Rivers stood motionless at the center of the stage, bow suspended, chest heaving with the effort of 8 minutes that had felt like eternity. The silence that followed was unbearable. Not the silence of indifference, but the charged stillness of people realizing they had just witnessed something that shifted the ground beneath their feet. Then, clap, 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 slow, deliberate, echoing like a bell tolling across the marble hall. All heads turned toward the source. Helen Morrison, concertmaster of the Detroit Symphony, seated near the back row. Tears streamed down her cheeks, tears that hadn't appeared in 30 years of performances. She rose to her feet, her applause sharp, insistent, undeniable. The sound cracked the spell. Dr. Eleanor Price followed, her frail body rising with surprising strength. She clapped with ferocity, her eyes shining with vindication. Faculty members exchanged stunned glances, then stood one by one, their hands joining the rhythm. Applause rolled forward like a wave consuming the hall. Board members, donors, and patrons rose reluctantly at first. Then with genuine abandon, their faces lit with awe. Even students in the back row, the very ones who had snickered earlier, found themselves clapping, their laughter replaced with something new: humility. Within seconds, the marble chamber thundered with a standing ovation. Jamal blinked, bewildered. His oversized shirt clung to his small frame, damp with sweat. The violin trembled in his hand, no longer heavy but buoyed by the roar of recognition. He searched the crowd, eyes finding his mother in the farthest row she could afford. Denise Rivers had risen too, her palms red from clapping, her tears falling freely. Her smile, cracked by exhaustion and years of sacrifice, now shone with pride, so fierce it filled the room. But one figure remained seated. Professor Richard Hawthorne gripped the edges of his mahogany podium like a drowning man clinging to driftwood, his Italian leather shoes pressed into marble that suddenly felt unstable. His silver hair, meticulously combed, seemed out of place under the chandelier's unforgiving light. His face cycled through disbelief, anger, denial, recognition. This wasn't supposed to happen, not here, not under his watch. He had predicted failure, humiliation, confirmation of his worldview. Instead, Vishen, a 12-year-old boy from Detroit's East Side, had just torn the script apart. In front of 30 witnesses, in front of Eleanor Price, in front of donors whose checkbooks fueled the Academy's survival. Hawthorne's throat tightened. He felt every clap like a lash, every cheer like a verdict. His reputation, built on exclusivity, on the belief that talent required pedigree, was unraveling in real time. On stage, Jamal lowered his violin slowly, reverently. He looked at the sea of standing bodies, their applause refusing to fade. His lips parted, but no words came. He didn't need them. The music had spoken louder than anything he could ever say. Yet the crowd wanted more, not music, but acknowledgement. They wanted the boy to claim his victory. Jamal's gaze fell on Hawthorne, still seated, still frozen in his collapsing throne of arrogance. For a moment, their eyes locked, a professor clinging to a shattered narrative, a boy carrying generations of struggle in his small frame. Jamal's voice, quiet but carrying across the marble hall, broke the air. "Thank you for the audition, Professor. I hope my kind of music meets your standards." The words detonated like a controlled explosion. Gasps rippled. Students who had mocked him felt their stomachs churn with shame. Board members exchanged wide-eyed looks. Faculty members pressed lips together to hide smirks. Dr. Price's eyes glittered with triumph. Helen Morrison's applause grew louder, leading the hall into thunder once again. And Hawthorne, his face drained of color. The boy had returned his cruelty, but with dignity sharp enough to cut marble. The predator had been declawed, exposed. The ovation swelled. "Bravo!" someone shouted from the back. "Magnificent!" another cried. Voices joined the applause, layering praise upon praise. Jamal's chest swelled, not with arrogance but with relief. He had survived. More than survived. He had conquered. Every dawn practice, every missed lunch, Every insult whispered in the school hallways had led to this. He glanced at Denise. She pressed her hands to her mouth, tears soaking her cheeks, nodding furiously as if telling him across the distance, "You did it. You did it for him. You did it for us." The violin in Jamal's hand seemed to hum still, its crack-lined back glowing under the chandelier light. It was no longer a relic of poverty. It was now an artifact of triumph, a witness to history. As the ovation finally ebbed, Eleanor Price stepped forward. Her small frame carried the weight of authority greater than Hawthorne's gold watch or mahogany podium. She climbed the stage, her cane-tapping rhythm on the polished floor, and placed her hand on Jamal's trembling shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice steady, amplified by decades of leadership, "we have just witnessed proof of what I have always believed. Greatness recognizes no boundaries. Talent requires no pedigree. And today, Eastwood Academy has been humbled by a boy who reminded us why music exists." Thunder erupted again. Hawthorne swallowed hard, his ears burning. He wanted to protest, to reclaim the narrative, but his words withered under the storm of applause. Students began approaching the stage. Sarah Wellington, daughter of one of Detroit's richest developers, stepped forward first. Her manicured hand trembled slightly as she extended it towards Jamal. "I'm sorry for the things I said. That was," she faltered, struggling to find words. "That was beyond anything I've ever heard. Would you sit with us at lunch?" Jamal blinked, tubinged, unsure how to respond. He had never been invited. Not like this. Another boy, Marcus Albright, son of the Detroit Symphony's assistant concertmaster, added awkwardly, "My mom's been trying to teach me Bach for 2 years. I thought it was just about hitting the notes. You showed me something else." Their humility was clumsy, but genuine. For the first time, Jamal was not the odd boy with the battered violin. He was the center, the example. And still, Hawthorne sat, finally with effort visible in every movement. He rose. The hall quieted instantly, all eyes on him. He stepped forward slowly, each tap of his heel echoing like Judgment Day. "Mr. Rivers," he began, his voice stripped of its earlier grandeur, raw and uncertain, "I owe you an apology, not only for today, but for every student like you I dismissed before listening. I thought I understood excellence. I thought it lived only in polish and pedigree. But you," his voice cracked, forcing him to swallow, "you've taught me more in 8 minutes than I learned in 30 years. Gasps fluttered through the hall. Hawthorne extended his hand, trembling slightly. "Perhaps you might teach an old professor something about listening with the heart, not the eyes." Jamal hesitated, then placed his small hand into the professor's. The handshake was not of equals in status, but of equals in music. The hall erupted once more. And in that roar, history shifted. What had begun as a setup for humiliation had transformed into a coronation. Jamal Rivers, 12 years old, wearing a borrowed shirt and clutching his father's cracked violin, had flipped the script of Eastwood Academy. He had silenced laughter with music, dismantled prejudice with fire, and forced the marble hall to admit a truth it had long denied. Talent doesn't check your address. Genius doesn't need permission. And sometimes the smallest voice carries the loudest truth. The thunder of applause finally softened into a low hum, like waves retreating after crashing against a shoreline. Jamal Rivers stood on stage, violin in hand, still trembling from the storm he had unleashed. The 12-year-old boy, in a shirt too large and shoes too tight, had shaken marble walls that once seemed designed to shut him out. Dr. Eleanor Price, still at his side, raised her hand for silence. The room obeyed instantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice sharp as glass but warm as sunlight, "Eastwood Academy has always claimed to uphold excellence. Today, excellence walked in through our front doors with a duct-taped violin case. And I, for one, refuse to let this moment pass as just an audition." She turned to Jamal, eyes shining. "Mr. Rivers, I am honored to inform you that your scholarship is approved. Full tuition, room and board, and private lessons with our faculty. But more than that, she paused, letting the weight of her words fill every corner of the hall. We will be establishing a new program in your father's name, the Terrence Rivers Memorial Scholarship. It will be dedicated to young musicians who prove, as you have, that greatness recognizes no boundaries. The hall erupted once again. Denise Rivers covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. For years, she had scrubbed hospital floors while her son practiced in the dark. Now, his father's name would echo through marble corridors that had once seemed unreachable. Jamal's vision blurred. He thought of Terrence's hands guiding his, the smell of coffee in their cramped kitchen, the jar labeled Music Fund that never seemed to fill. Now, his father's name would outlive poverty, carved into Eastwood's history. As applause subsided, another figure stepped forward. Helen Morrison, her cheeks still wet with tears, extended a business card with trembling fingers. "Young man," she said, voice unsteady but resolute. "I've heard prodigies. I've shared the stage with the best in the world. But what you just gave us wasn't just skill. It was truth. This summer, the Detroit Symphony Youth Orchestra has a concert at Orchestra Hall. I would like you to perform with us." The room gasped. Orchestra Hall, the place where Yo-Yo Ma had played, where Perlman's bow had danced, where Terrence Rivers had once sat in the cheapest seats and whispered to his son, "That'll be you someday." Jamal clutched the card as though it were gold leaf. He could barely breathe. Faculty members swarmed, their polished professionalism cracking. Dr. Richards, normally stoic, scribbled notes furiously about changing curriculum to emphasize emotional truth. Professor Anderson, the composition teacher, murmured about collaborations. Board members, usually more concerned with fundraising galas than music, suddenly spoke in hushed excitement about outreach programs, about funding more Devons and Jamals across Detroit. Mrs. Hamilton, a wealthy donor with pearls strung around her neck like armor, leaned toward Dr. Price. "How much would it cost to find 100 more boys like him? 1,000? Whatever it is, we'll make it happen." But the most profound moment came when Richard Hawthorne himself stepped forward. His polished facade was shattered. His face was pale, his gold watch ticking too loudly in the silence. He approached Jamal with the weight of 30 years pressing down on his shoulders. "Mr. Rivers," he said, voice stripped of its arrogance, "I owe you an apology. Today I saw what I have refused to see for too long. I thought I understood excellence. I mistook pedigree for talent, polish for greatness. But you," he swallowed hard, "you have reminded me that music is not born in privilege. It is born in fire. And today you've taught me more than I have taught in decades." He extended his hand. Jamal hesitated only a heartbeat before shaking it. "Music belongs to everyone who needs it," Jamal said softly. "Maybe we can help each other remember that." For the first time in his career, Richard Hawthorne's eyes filled with tears. 6 months later, Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Orchestra Hall. The hall glowed with golden light, the stage crowded with professionals whose instruments gleamed under chandeliers. Among them stood Jamal Rivers, 12 years old, holding the same battered violin. The crack along its back had been repaired by the symphony's luthier, but deliberately left visible, a scar that told the truth of its journey. In the front row, Denise sat in a new dress, her hands folded tight to stop them from trembling. She had taken fewer double shifts now, allowed herself moments of rest. Beside her, Richard Hawthorne sat, tears streaming openly as he clapped. He had traded arrogance for advocacy, dedicating himself to the Terrence Rivers Memorial Program. When Jamal lifted his bow, the hall fell silent. And then, as the first note soared, it wasn't just Bach anymore. It was Detroit. It was every cracked wall, every jar of coins, every dream deferred and finally realized. 2 years later, New York City, Carnegie Hall. The stage that had carried legends now bore a boy from Detroit's East Side, Jamal Rivers. 14, stood taller, his violin gleaming under lights that had illuminated history. Critics filled the seats, alongside donors, students, and dreamers. The program listed his name alongside Bach's Partita Number 2. The same piece that had once been a weapon of humiliation now became his anthem. In the audience, Denise dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, Hawthorne, now director of the Terrence Rivers Memorial Program, watched with pride and humility. Dr. Eleanor Price, in her wheelchair at 84, whispered to herself, "This is why we built it." The first note rang out, rich and true. Social media would later explode with clips. Hashtags like "talent has no address" and hashtag "music is for everyone" would trend worldwide. Critics would call it transcendent. But in that hall, at that moment, it wasn't about hashtags or reviews. It was about a promise kept, a boy's promise to his father, a family's sacrifice turned to triumph. The legacy, back in Detroit, the Terrence Rivers Memorial Program flourished. Dozens of children from overlooked neighborhoods now held instruments with pride. Some studied at Eastwood. Others went on to conservatories across the country. Privilege and poverty shared the same stage, their boundaries blurred by music. Jamal continued to rise, not just as a violinist, but as a symbol. A reminder that genius doesn't ask permission, that excellence can come from duct tape and determination as easily as from silk ties and trust funds. And every time he lifted that violin, scar still visible. Jamal knew he wasn't playing alone. His father's hands were still there, guiding him. His mother's voice still whispered encouragement. And now an entire city, an entire academy, and perhaps even the world, had learned to listen with their hearts. The story that began with a professor sneering, "Classical music ain't bad for kids like you," ended with a boy proving that music belongs to anyone bold enough to claim it. And for those who doubted, those who dismissed, those who sneered, their laughter had long since been drowned out by the sound of standing ovations.